We arrived at the lakeside cabin on Christmas Eve, the snow falling softly around us like a blanket from the heavens. The air was cold, sharp enough to bite, but not so bitter as to deter us from starting our holiday. The cabin sat on the edge of the frozen lake, its old wood creaking and groaning like it had lived through 100 winters. We'd been looking forward to this break for months, away from the noise, away from the rush of city life. Just the four of us, surrounded by nothing but white hills, snow-covered trees, and the frozen stretch of water that seemed to stretch on forever. We didn't know that the locals were already watching us when we arrived. The first warning came from an old man at the general store, his grey eyes dull beneath a bushy brow. He muttered something about the ice, something about the dangers of the lake at night. He spoke in a low, gravelly voice, and though his words were soft, the weight of them lingered in the air long after he'd shuffled off. "It's dangerous after dark," he had said. We shrugged it off. Nothing to worry about, just an old man with strange superstitions. The ice looked thick enough, solid enough to walk on. We even drove the car out onto it, the crunching sound beneath the wheels making me feel absurdly secure. But when we got back to the cabin, we made sure to lock the doors and stay inside as darkness fell. The first night passed without incident, but by the morning something felt wrong. It was subtle at first, a silence that hung too heavily in the air, a sense of being watched. We went about our morning routine, but I kept looking out the window, half expecting to see a figure standing on the far shore of the lake staring at us. Of course, there was nothing there. It wasn't until later in the day, after we had spent some time on the ice, that things started to shift. We were all inside the cabin, warming up with mugs of hot chocolate, when I realized that our youngest Ben was no longer with us. At first, I thought nothing of it. He had a tendency to wander off, always with some excuse about exploring or looking for something interesting. But when I called for him, there was no answer. The house was eerily quiet, and I began to feel a familiar sting of panic. I went out onto the porch and shouted again, scanning the snow for his small figure. There was nothing at first, just the expanse of white, the snow-covered trees, and the lake beyond, still as glass. Then I saw it. Tracks, small, child-sized footprints, leading down the path, past the shed and towards the ice. The faintest impression of his boots in the snow, each step sinking deeper into the white powder. I called for him once more, but my voice was swallowed by the wind, no answer. My stomach churned, tightening into a knot of dread. I knew instinctively that something was wrong. The tracks led straight onto the lake. My heart thudded in my chest as I stared at them. Ben wouldn't have gone out there alone. We had told him not to. The ice wasn't just dangerous, it was a trap, waiting to swallow anyone who dared to tread on it after dark. And yet, there they were. His tracks, leading to the frozen expanse. We followed them, my heart pounding louder with each step. The wind had picked up, howling across the surface of the lake, and the world felt too big, too empty. The tracks wound over the ice, leading further and further out into the center, where the frozen lake stretched into an endless white horizon. We had almost reached the middle when I saw it, a dark shape just beyond the edge of my vision, shifting against the backdrop of the snow. I froze. For a moment I wasn't sure if it was the wind or the play of shadows or something far worse, but then I saw it again. The shape was human, but distorted, too tall, too thin, moving slowly, deliberately towards the center of the lake where we stood. The wind howled louder, and the ice beneath my feet creaked. My heart started to race. We were far from the shore, and the sight of the figure sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the cold. The figure was no longer moving. I could feel its presence, though I couldn't see its face, but there was no mistaking the feeling. It was as if someone was watching us, waiting for us to make the next move. And then, just as quickly as it appeared, the figure vanished into the whiteness. The silence that followed was unbearable. We were alone now. The tracks, the figure, all of it was gone. I stood frozen on the ice, my breath coming out in short gasps. I wanted to turn back, to run to the cabin, but my legs wouldn't obey me. I glanced back at the tracks, the ones leading us onto the ice, and I saw something I hadn't noticed before. More tracks. These were larger, deeper, too large to be Ben's, and they were coming toward us. The snow was perfect that morning, crisp, untouched, glittering under the low winter sun like shards of broken glass. It was the kind of Christmas day you imagine in a postcard, all blue skies and breathless cold. We'd planned this trip for weeks, 5 of us, old friends from university who hadn't been in the same place for years. Cross-country skiing through the silent woods, away from the city and the stress of Christmas obligations, sounded like just the thing to reconnect. We set out early, bundled against the cold and armed with maps and good intentions. The trail wound through the pine forest, their branches heavy with snow, bending under the weight like old men stooping. The air was so still that the crunch of our skis on the packed trail sounded unnaturally loud, echoing off the trees. We laughed and teased each other, our breath fogging in the frigid air. The kind of easy camaraderie you can only have with people who've known you for years. We weren't prepared when Emma disappeared. She had been just ahead of us, her red scarf standing out against the white like a splash of blood. One minute she was there, gliding effortlessly over the snow, and the next she was gone. I remember the moment I realized something was wrong, how the laughter died, replaced by an awful heavy silence. We called her name, but the sound of it seemed to get swallowed up by the trees. Her tracks veered off the trail, cutting sharply to the left, towards the dense woods where the snow lay deeper. We followed them, stumbling and cursing, as the skis became more hindrance than help. The tracks ended abruptly at the base of a tree. There were no prints leading away, no sign of where she could have gone, and then we saw it, a patch of disturbed snow, shallow and uneven, flecked with something dark. Blood, maybe. The fear settled in like a stone in my gut. We argued, though I couldn't have told you about what. The decision was made to split up and search. It seemed logical at the time. The woods were vast and daylight was fading fast. 3 of us stayed together, while the others spread out into the growing shadows. It wasn't long before we found the first sign of a struggle, a broken ski pole lying in the snow, its jagged end darkened with something that might have been sap, or something worse. The marks in the snow around it were frantic, deep gouges and strange circular patterns that didn't look like footprints. By then the forest seemed darker than it should have been, as if the shadows had crept closer. The silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It was oppressive, the kind that presses against your ears and makes you feel like you're being watched. We kept moving, though none of us wanted to admit we were no longer searching for Emma. Not really. The hope had died back at the tree. Now it was just about staying together, about getting back to the trail and out of the woods before the darkness swallowed us. But the woods didn't want to let us go. We stumbled on more signs, shreds of fabric snagged on low branches, another broken ski pole, and then something worse. It was buried under a thin layer of snow, half concealed, as if the forest itself was trying to hide it. A glove, Emma's glove, and inside it her hand. We froze, staring at the grotesque thing lying there, the skin pale and stiff, the fingers curled into a claw. No one spoke, but I could feel the shift, the way the fear turned inward, twisting into suspicion. It wasn't the woods, someone's eyes seemed to say. It wasn't the woods at all. By the time we regrouped, the tension was thick enough to choke on. No one said it outright, but the questions hung in the air. Who had been last to see her? Whose voice had echoed through the trees, calling her name? The snowstorm rolled in just before nightfall, a blinding wall of white that turned the forest into a labyrinth. We couldn't tell where we'd come from or where we were going. The cold bit deep, numbing fingers and toes, sapping what little resolve we had left. And then we started to disappear, one by one. I was with James when it happened. He was walking just ahead of me, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the swirling snow. One moment he was there, his shadow stretching long and thin, and the next, he was gone. No sound, no struggle, just the faint impression of his footprints leading into the dark. Now it's just me, my breath fogging the air, my heart pounding so loud it feels like it might burst. The forest is alive with movement, shapes flitting at the edges of my vision, their shadows stretching long and thin, twisting into forms that don't belong. Ahead, through the trees, I see them, my friends standing in a circle, their backs to me. Emma is with them, her red scarf trailing in the wind, her gloved hand raised as if to beckon me closer. But her hand isn't whole. The snow is stained beneath them, dark and spreading, the air thick with the copper tang of blood. They're waiting for me. I can feel it like a pressure in my chest, pulling me forward, and now I'm walking towards them. The snowstorm rolled in faster than anyone had expected, swallowing the road and blurring the forest into a blank white wasteland. By the time we reached the ski lodge, my nerves were already shot. The tires had slipped on black ice twice, and a deer had darted out in front of us, vanishing into the trees like a ghost. We had booked the cabin months ago, planning our office Christmas retreat as a last hurrah before the holidays. The idea was to bond, to blow off steam, to forget about budgets and deadlines for a few days. The cabin sat at the end of a narrow trail, perched on the edge of a forest that stretched out like a jagged ink stain against the snow. The windows glowed warmly in the twilight, promising safety from the storm. Relief washed over me as I grabbed my bags and crunched through the snow towards the door. But the moment I stepped inside, that relief turned to something else, something sharp and cold. They were already there, 5 of them, 5 strangers standing in the living room, their coats dripping melted snow onto the wooden floor. They stared at us with the same mixture of confusion and hostility that must have been plastered on our faces. It didn't take long to figure out what had happened. A mistake in the booking system. 2 groups, 1 cabin. We argued, of course. Tensions were high from the drive, and the storm outside was building into a howling monster. No one was willing to leave, not with the roads impassable and the temperature plummeting. The strangers insisted the cabin was theirs, waving printed confirmations in our faces. We did the same. The small, warm room filled with anger, the kind that gnaws at you and makes your chest tight. Eventually an uneasy truce was reached. There was enough space after all, and it was only for one night. Tomorrow, someone would clear the mess up and one of us would leave. The strangers took the upstairs bedrooms. We stayed on the lower floor, claiming the couches and the pull-out bed. It felt like a powder keg, ready to blow at the slightest spark. The storm outside raged on, wind hammering against the windows and shaking the shutters. The warmth of the fire did little to ease the tension. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like an accusation. Every glance from one of the strangers felt like a threat. I caught snatches of hushed voices from the upstairs rooms, the strangers whispering in a language I didn't recognize. My co-workers were just as on edge, muttering darkly about the strangers' presence, their strange behavior, the way they hovered close together like a pack of wolves. Sometime in the night, the power went out, the fire died to embers, and the cabin was plunged into darkness. I woke to the sound of footsteps above, heavy and deliberate, moving back and forth. The others stirred too, their faces pale in the dim light of a flashlight. We tried to ignore it, to pass it off as the strangers pacing in their room, but the sound didn't stop. It moved to the stairs, slow and steady, each creak echoing through the cabin. The flashlight's beam trembled as we pointed it towards the staircase. Nothing. No one, but the footsteps continued, circling us, closing in. Then came the first scream, high and sharp, cutting through the storm like a knife. It came from upstairs, followed by the unmistakable sound of something heavy hitting the floor. We froze, our breaths pluming in the cold air. More noises followed, muffled shouts, the crash of furniture, a wet, gurgling sound that made my stomach turn. By the time we summoned the courage to climb the stairs, it was too late. The stranger's room was empty, save for the blood. It pooled on the floorboards and splattered the walls, streaks of crimson leading to the broken window. The storm swallowed everything beyond the shattered glass, leaving only the tracks, bare feet in the snow, heading into the forest. We bolted back downstairs, locking the doors and barricading them with furniture. Panic gripped us, raw and primal. No one could explain what had happened or why. The strangers had turned on each other, we decided, though no one said it aloud. It was easier to believe that than the alternative. But then the footsteps started again. This time they weren't confined to the stairs. They came from every direction, the kitchen, the hallway, the front porch. The cabin groaned under the weight of something unseen, something circling us, pressing closer. The barricades trembled as if pushed by invisible hands. My co-workers huddled together, their faces pale and drawn, eyes darting to every shadow. The last thing I remember is the door, splintering inward. Something stepped through, something that didn't belong, its outline wrong, its presence colder than the storm outside. The snowstorm swallowed the screams, then silence. Snow has a way of swallowing sound, turning the world into something both beautiful and suffocating. That's what I kept telling myself as I stood at the frosted window, staring out at the endless white. The cabin was supposed to be cozy, a picture-perfect retreat where we could play at being a family for a few days. Instead, it felt like the snow was pressing in, piling up against the windows and doors, hemming us in while the world disappeared under its weight. Richard had left that morning, muttering apologies about an urgent client meeting in the city. I told him we'd be fine. It wasn't like he could cancel Christmas just because of a little snow. I could handle his kids for a couple of days. They were quiet, polite enough, though Sam, the older one, barely looked at me, and Mia spent most of her time glued to her tablet. Blended families take time to mix, I told myself. By afternoon, the storm had rolled in fully, a thick, howling blizzard that obscured everything beyond a few meters. The power flickered once, but held. I turned on the gas fireplace and tried to settle the kids with a board game, but they weren't having it. The wind battered the cabin, and the temperature seemed to drop by the hour. I bundled them up in extra blankets and tried to ignore the unease creeping up my spine. It was just a snowstorm. People romanticized them in movies and postcards. But the reality was cold and miserable and isolating. It was after dinner when we heard the knock. I froze, the sound echoing through the quiet cabin. 3 sharp raps on the front door. The kids looked at me, eyes wide, and I forced a smile, told them to stay put. My heart was pounding as I approached the door, half expecting to find Richard there, having decided to turn back after all. But when I opened it, the doorway was empty. No car in the drive, no figure on the porch. Just the storm howling and swirling, and a single set of footprints leading away into the darkness. I stepped out, the icy wind biting at my skin, and looked around. The prints vanished into the blizzard after a few meters, erased by the falling snow. I locked the door when I came back inside. Sam asked me who it was, and I told him it must have been a mistake, maybe someone lost or confused. I tried to keep my voice steady, but my hands were shaking. Something about those footprints had chilled me more than the storm. The power went out an hour later. It wasn't an abrupt cut, but a slow, sputtering fade. The lights dimmed and flickered, and then the cabin was plunged into darkness. I fumbled for the flashlight I'd left in the kitchen drawer, the beam weak and jittery in my unsteady hands. The gas fireplace still glowed faintly, but the cabin felt colder already. And then I heard it, a soft creak from the back of the house, like a footstep. I told myself it was the wind, the old wood shifting in the cold. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone else was in the cabin with us. I moved quietly to check the back door. The lock was intact, the door still bolted shut, but the kitchen window was cracked open just enough to let the icy wind in. I was sure I'd locked it earlier. I closed it and turned back to the kids, my heart thundering in my chest. Sam and Mia were huddled together on the couch, their faces pale in the flickering firelight. I whispered that we needed to leave, that we couldn't stay here. They didn't argue. I bundled them into their coats and boots, my hands clumsy with panic. The wind howled louder as I opened the front door, the cold slicing through me like a knife. The footprints were back, fresh tracks leading away from the cabin and into the woods, but this time there were more of them. A second set of prints ran parallel to the first, crossing back and forth as though whoever had left them had been circling the cabin. We stepped into the snow and the wind swallowed us whole. The path to the main road was nearly invisible, buried under a foot of snow and swept clean in places by the wind. I held Mia's hand tightly, Sam trudging just behind us. The flashlight's beam barely cut through the storm, but I kept moving, kept telling myself we'd reach the road soon, that someone would find us. Then I saw them. Just for a moment, out of the corner of my eye, a figure standing in the trees, still as the snow, watching us. I turned, the flashlight trembling in my hand, but they were gone, just shadows and snow. I told the kids to keep going, to move faster, but Sam tripped, crying out as he fell face first into the snow. I pulled him up, brushing the ice from his face, and that's when I saw the tracks again, fresh prints circling around us, overlapping our own. They weren't ours. I didn't wait. I grabbed Sam's arm and practically dragged him forward, Mia stumbling along behind us. The storm seemed to close in, the wind screaming like a living thing, and every time I looked back I saw shadows flickering at the edge of the light. The cabin loomed out of the snow before I realized we'd turned around. Somehow, without even noticing, I'd led us in a circle. The tracks in the snow were everywhere now, spiraling around the cabin, cutting across our own. And the door was open, just a crack, enough to see the darkness waiting inside. Something was standing in the doorway. Something that wasn't Richard. I screamed, grabbing the kids and running, the cold burning in my lungs and the darkness pressing in on all sides. The road had to be close. It had to be. We didn't stop until we saw headlights cutting through the storm. A plough driver found us, half frozen and delirious, stumbling out of the trees onto the main road. He didn't ask questions, just helped us into the truck and drove us into town. When the storm cleared the next morning, they found the cabin door frozen open, the inside coated in a fine layer of snow. There were no footprints. No signs that anyone else had been there at all. Just an empty cabin, standing silent in the woods. The cold up there wasn't like anything I'd ever felt before. It wasn't just the sting on your cheeks or the ache in your hands. It sank in, burrowing deep into your bones, making it feel like it was trying to hollow you out from the inside. When I agreed to the trip, I didn't think it would be like that. I'd thought of Alaska as rugged and wild, sure, but not as a place that might eat you alive if you let your guard down. The village, if you could even call it that, was barely a handful of houses and a rundown general store. The lake was about a mile out, a wide, flat expanse of ice stretching so far that it felt like we were standing on the edge of the world. Rick had been the one to organize the trip, saying it would be a great escape, a way to reconnect after years of drifting apart, but it didn't feel like that. It felt like something was pressing down on us, heavy and unrelenting, like the weight of the cold or the unending sky. We tried to ignore it at first, joking and drinking and pretending we weren't freezing half to death. But there was no warmth between us, no easy camaraderie. Then it happened. It was Danny who went in. One moment he was standing there, his red parka vivid against the blue-white of the ice, and the next he was gone. The sound of the crack was sharp and sudden, like a whip, and I'll never forget the look of shock on his face as he plunged into the freezing water. He didn't even scream, just a splash, a desperate gasp, and then silence. We ran to the edge of the hole, shouting his name, but there was nothing. The water was black, impossibly dark, and the ripples faded almost instantly, leaving the ice still and unbroken once more. It was like the lake had swallowed him whole, like it had been waiting for him. We should have gone for help right away. But the village was so far, and the storm was moving in fast. Rick said we couldn't just leave him out there, that we had to search, and none of us wanted to be the one to say no. So we stayed, fanning out across the lake, calling his name and looking for any sign of him. The first night, the wind picked up, howling across the ice like a living thing. We huddled in the shack we'd rented, the small heater barely keeping the frost at bay. No one spoke, no one could. Danny was gone, and we all knew it, but none of us wanted to admit it. By the second day, the cracks started to show, not in the ice, but in us. Rick blamed Sarah, saying she'd been too close to him when it happened, that she should have stopped him from stepping there. Sarah snapped back, accusing Rick of dragging us all out there in the first place. Kevin sat in the corner, muttering about how the ice had been too thin, how we should have known better. And me? I just watched, feeling the tension coil tighter and tighter, waiting for it to snap. The food started running low that night. The store in the village had been poorly stocked, and we hadn't brought enough with us, thinking we'd catch fish to supplement it. But the lake was barren, yielding nothing but bitter cold and a creeping sense of dread. By the third day, we weren't searching anymore, not really. Rick still went out, stomping across the ice and calling Danny's name, but the rest of us stayed in the shack, conserving what little energy we had. The cold seeped in through the walls, the heater sputtering as the storm outside grew fiercer. That's when the whispers started. At first, I thought it was just the wind, a strange trick of the storm, but then I realized it wasn't coming from outside, it was inside, low and insistent, like someone murmuring just on the edge of hearing. The others heard it too. I could see it in their faces, but no one said anything. Maybe we were afraid to admit it, afraid of what it might mean. That night I dreamed of Danny. He was standing on the ice, his face pale and wet, his eyes sunken and dark. He didn't say anything, just raised one hand and pointed toward the hole where he'd gone in. I woke up shivering, the image of his face burned into my mind. By the fourth day, things fell apart completely. Kevin accused Rick of hoarding food, and Rick hit him hard. Sarah started crying, and I just sat there staring at the door, wondering if Danny was still out there, if he was watching us. The whispers had grown louder, almost a chant, a low, rhythmic sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. That night, Rick disappeared. We found his boot prints leading out onto the lake, ending at the same hole where Danny had gone in. There were no signs of a struggle, no evidence of where he'd gone, just those prints, stopping at the edge of the water. Sarah said she'd heard him talking in the night, mumbling something under his breath, but she hadn't been able to make out the words. The storm broke on the fifth day, and I decided to leave. I told Sarah and Kevin we couldn't stay any longer, that we'd die out there if we didn't get back to the village. Kevin refused, saying he had to stay, that he couldn't leave without Rick. Sarah just stared at me, her eyes hollow and sunken, her lips blue from the cold. I left without them. The walk back was brutal, the wind still biting and the snow knee-deep in places. When I reached the village, no one believed me at first. They said the lake had been cursed for decades, that no one fished there anymore. I didn't care. I just wanted to get out, to get as far away from that place as I could. The Arctic wind howled as if alive, whipping through the narrow corridors of the ship and rattling the windows like impatient fists. It started as a low groan, a deep shudder through the hull that woke me from a restless sleep. By morning, the cruise liner was frozen in place, the jagged teeth of the ice clutching it in a merciless grip. We were trapped in a glacial no-man's land, surrounded by a pale, endless expanse. The captain assured us the icebreakers would come, but hours stretched into days, and the only thing breaking was our faith. The power flickered on the second night, and by the third it was gone entirely. The grand buffet and festive lights that had promised us a luxurious Christmas were reduced to cold rations and the flicker of flashlights. People began to mutter about the cold creeping in through the walls, about how much harder it was to breathe in the lower decks. When someone spotted a faint smudge of buildings on the horizon, we convinced ourselves it was salvation, a distant settlement just waiting for us to come to it. We abandoned the ship on Christmas Eve, bundled in mismatched layers, dragging suitcases and backpacks across the frozen expanse like refugees fleeing some unseen disaster. The cold was unrelenting, a living thing that gnawed at my bones no matter how many scarves or jackets I wore. It was the kind of cold that seeped into your blood, made your thoughts slow and sluggish. The group started strong, united by shared misery, but the ice had a way of stripping people down. Conversations grew terse, friendships frayed like old rope. By the second day, we were snapping at each other over trivial things, how much water we had left, whose turn it was to carry the emergency supplies. And then people started disappearing. The first was the young couple from Deck 3. They'd been walking ahead of us, laughing, their boots crunching on the ice. When I glanced up again, they were gone, just gone. We searched for hours, shouting their names into the freezing wind, but there wasn't even a set of tracks to follow. It was like the ice had swallowed them whole. By the next morning, we were down 3 more. No one saw them leave and no one heard a sound. They simply weren't there anymore. Their places in the line left as empty as their bunks on the ship. Fear seeped in like the cold, making everything brittle and sharp. Someone suggested we turn back to the ship, but by then it was a faint smudge in the distance, indistinguishable from the ice around it. The settlement seemed closer, but the buildings were little more than grey ghosts on the horizon, always just out of reach no matter how far we walked. Supplies were running low. Food became a point of contention. Who had eaten the last protein bar? Who was hoarding snacks? I stopped sleeping, convinced that the second I closed my eyes I'd vanish too. On the 5th day, I woke to find blood smeared across the ice like a streak of rust. One of the men from the upper decks was kneeling over a carcass. It wasn't human, but it wasn't an animal either, not any animal I recognized. The shape was wrong, too many joints where there shouldn't have been any. The skin was dark and glistened in the weak sunlight, as if it had been pulled straight out of the water. He didn't answer when I called to him, just tore another strip of flesh with teeth stained red. We stopped being a group after that. People drifted off in pairs or alone, as if proximity to others was dangerous. I stayed with a woman I'd met early on. Sarah, I think her name was, though it feels like I knew her a lifetime ago. We didn't talk. There was no need. The crunch of boots on ice and the occasional snap of wind was enough. When the settlement came into focus at last, it wasn't the haven I'd imagined. The buildings were skeletal, leaning against one another like drunks in an alley. Smoke curled from a single chimney, but it was the wrong colour, grey, black and oily. There were figures, I think, moving in the shadows, but they didn't come out to meet us. Sarah ran ahead, calling for help, her voice bouncing off the frostbitten walls. I hung back, feet frozen to the ground, watching as the figures moved closer to her. She screamed once, and then there was nothing. Now it's just me. The sky is turning dark, a deep, bruised purple that makes the ice shimmer. I don't know if I should keep moving or turn back, though I suspect it doesn't matter. Somewhere behind me, faint and distant, I hear the crunch of boots on snow, but I'm not moving. The headlights caught the deer just as it darted out of the woods, a flash of sleek brown and panicked eyes. There was no time to brake, no time to swerve. The impact was sickening, a heavy thud that shook the car and sent us skidding across the icy back road. When we finally stopped, the world seemed to hold its breath, the silence broken only by the faint tick of the cooling engine and the low whimper of the wind through the pines. We climbed out to assess the damage. The deer was dead, its lifeless body sprawled in the snow, but our car wasn't much better. The bonnet was crumpled and the radiator hissed out a faint, chilling steam. It didn't take long to realize we were stranded. The road stretched out in both directions, a thin ribbon of grey cutting through the endless expanse of snow-covered trees. No other cars, no lights, no signs of life. The cold gnawed at us, vicious and unrelenting. We had no choice but to start walking. It wasn't long before we saw the cabin. It sat back from the road, a dark silhouette against the snow, its windows black and empty. It didn't look welcoming, but it was shelter and the temperature was dropping fast. The door was unlocked, creaking open on rusty hinges. Inside it smelled of damp wood and something else, something faintly metallic, like old blood. At first glance, the cabin seemed like any other hunter's retreat. There were racks of rifles on the wall, a battered table in the center of the room, and a pile of wood stacked neatly by the cold fireplace. But as we looked closer, things began to feel off. The first clue was the traps. They were piled in the corner, cruel metal jaws designed to snap shut with bone-breaking force. But they weren't just for animals. Some were far too large, and others had been crudely modified, the teeth sharper, the springs reinforced. Then there was the ledger. It was sitting on the table, open to a page filled with names and dates. Next to each name was a chilling notation: tag-filled, trophy-bagged. Some names had question marks beside them, others were underlined, and not all the names were followed by species. That's when we saw the freezer. It was large and industrial, its metal sides frosted with ice. There were no lights inside the cabin, so we had to use the faint glow of a phone to see. When we opened the lid, the smell hit us first. A rancid, stomach-turning stench that made us reel. Then we saw what was inside. Animal carcasses, yes, but also other things that shouldn't have been there. The storm was picking up outside, the wind howling like a living thing, and we began to hear noises. Footsteps crunching in the snow, voices carried faintly on the wind. They were back. We scrambled to hide, ducking into a small storage room at the back of the cabin. Through the crack in the door, we saw them enter. There were 3 of them, dressed in heavy coats and boots, their faces shadowed by the brims of their hats. They moved with purpose, setting down bags and rifles, talking in low voices. One of them opened the freezer, inspecting its contents with a satisfied grunt. Another began unpacking the bags, pulling out ropes, knives, and something that looked disturbingly like a branding iron. We didn't wait to see what they were planning. We slipped out the back door and into the forest, our footsteps muffled by the thick snow. But the hunters must have heard something, because moments later we heard the bark of a dog and the sharp, eager voices of men giving chase. The forest was a nightmare. The snow was deep, and the cold sapped our strength with every step. The trees closed in around us, their bare branches clawing at the sky, and the hunters were relentless. We heard their shouts and the baying of the dog, the crack of gunfire splitting the air. At one point we stumbled into a clearing and found another trap. This one had been set for something large, its jagged teeth glinting in the moonlight. It was empty, but the snow around it was stained dark with old blood. We kept moving. Hours passed, or maybe it was only minutes. Time seemed to stretch and warp in the freezing dark. The hunters were close, their voices growing louder, more confident. Then we saw it, a narrow ravine, its edges steep and treacherous, but the other side was dense with trees, offering a chance to disappear. We made it halfway across when we heard the snap. The snow beneath us gave way, and we tumbled into the ravine, landing hard on the frozen ground below. Pain shot through me, but I forced myself to move, dragging myself to the shelter of the trees. Behind us, the hunters reached the edge of the ravine, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. Then, as if the forest itself had turned against them, the ground beneath them crumbled. They fell, their screams echoing through the night, cut short by the sickening thud of bodies hitting ice. For a moment, there was silence. We didn't wait to see if they were alive. We stumbled through the forest, driven by some primal instinct to keep moving. When we finally reached the road, a pair of headlights appeared in the distance. A truck, its driver staring at us in shock as we flagged him down. We told the police everything, but when they went to the cabin, they found nothing. No traps, no ledger, no freezer filled with horrors. Just an empty shell of a building, abandoned and forgotten. The snow was thick. It blanketed the forest floor like a heavy quilt, muffling the sounds of the world, leaving me alone with only the crunch of my boots and the distant calls of birds. Unsettlingly distant. The missing child had been last seen during the Christmas festival, just an hour before the storm began to close in. They said he wandered off into the woods while chasing a fallen star from the sky, but I knew better. I'd spent enough time in these woods to know that the forest doesn't swallow people without a reason. They'd hired me because I knew this place. I knew the way the trees leaned in like they were watching you, the way the snow held on to tracks for just long enough before the wind erased them. I wasn't afraid of the woods. I'd never been afraid of them. It had started well enough. A broken twig here, a footprint there, small signs that a child might have been running, lost in the excitement but no sign of foul play. I traced the trail deeper into the woods, keeping my eyes sharp. There was a smell in the air, though, something sweet, like burning sugar, a smell that didn't belong in a forest. The snow-covered ground seemed to swallow the scent, but it clung to my nostrils. I didn't like it. The trail led me into a clearing. The trees around it were gnarled and bent, their branches twisted like fingers clawing at the sky. There were fresh prints here too, but they were wrong, too large for a child. They circled the clearing, then disappeared into the woods on the opposite side. Whoever had made them wasn't trying to cover their tracks. They were guiding me, pushing me deeper. I followed the prints. The snow was coming down harder now, a blizzard that swirled around me in thick gusts. The air was thin, cold enough to bite. The scent of burning sugar grew stronger, and then I saw it. I thought it was a trick of the snow, a pile of branches or maybe some animal's den. But when I approached, I saw it clearly. A small shack, its rotting wood half buried under the weight of the snow. The windows were dark, but through the gaps in the walls I could see something moving inside, shapes, shadows, but no sound. I approached cautiously, my breath hanging in the air like smoke. I didn't want to go inside, but I had no choice. The door creaked open with a slow groan as if the shack itself was sighing. My breath caught in my throat. There, in the center of the room, was the child, barely breathing, his clothes torn and bloody, his eyes wide open but unseeing. His skin had an unnatural pallor, as if the life had been drained out of him, and his mouth hung open in a silent scream that never quite reached his lips. I knelt beside him, but something made me pause. An instinct, a gut feeling. A slight sound, barely a whisper, came from behind me. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. It was as if I could feel the presence before I heard it. The air was thick, colder than it had ever been before, and it wasn't just the snow. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I took a slow, steady breath. The child wasn't alone. I stood slowly, never turning around. My heart thudded in my chest. The shadows in the corners of the shack seemed to stretch, to grow, as if they were alive. I could hear them now, moving, scraping against the walls. A voice, low, whispering, drifted through the air like the wind speaking through dead leaves. It was close, so close, but I couldn't make sense of it. I took one step, then another. My hands tightened around the rifle at my side, though I knew it wouldn't help me now. Nothing would. Then a shape moved in the corner of the room. I saw it too late. A pale, thin hand shot out from the shadows, grabbing me by the wrist with a grip like ice. My pulse hammered in my ears as I tried to pull free, but the fingers were like claws, digging deep into my skin. A dark figure loomed in front of me, and I saw nothing but the void behind its hollow eyes. It dragged me back. I fought, but I couldn't break free. The shack seemed to pulse, the walls closing in around me, and then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the air went cold. The door slammed shut behind me with a deafening bang, and the world outside went silent. Everything was still. I turned around to see the shack, now completely dark, its silhouette swallowed by the storm. No sign of the child, no sign of anything. Then the whispers started again, soft, faint, as though the wind itself had learned to speak. But this time they were louder,